Colombians have taken to the streets in a show of solidarity with the Gustavo Petro's government's proposed social reforms amidst a smear campaign led by the opposition and right-wing media. Why has the Petro government found itself under attack? A sprawling new police training facility worth millions of public funds may soon replace Atlanta's local forests after the local administration pushed through a vote in favor of what is being called Cop City. There's a new update on the struggle of French workers against the pension reforms. This is Daily Debrief. I'm your host Shriya, and these are the stories of the day. Thousands took to the streets across Colombia in support of the labor pension and healthcare reforms proposed by the Gustavo Petro government. The mobilization called for by the country's major trade union confederations, including CUT and CTC, also comes in response to the destabilization campaign against the government being waged by right-wing politicians and mainstream media. In recent months, the government led by Petro and Vice President Francia Marquez has been under attack from the right-wing bloc in the legislature and media after it presented proposals to reform the country's healthcare system, pensions, and labor legislation. We're joined by Zoe Alexandra, who has more details on the issue. Welcome to the show, Zoe. So, why is the opposition targeting the Petro government at this point of time?
Well, the Colombian far right has really been targeting Gustavo Petro even before he was sworn in as president. During his campaign, he received constant threats from not only far-right paramilitary groups, but also from politicians using extremely divisive language. As many people know, Gustavo Petro was a member of a left-wing guerrilla group, the M19, and of course, for the right wing, which essentially says all of these groups are terrorist groups, this, of course, led them to say that Gustavo Petro is a terrorist, that he is against peace, and all sorts of things which are completely not based in the reality, not based in his political program, not based in his actions as a member of the legislature, as mayor of Bogota. And so these attacks have really been constant since he's been politically active and especially active in the national level. And so once he is sworn in as president, once he wins the elections, it becomes clear that their attacks are going to have to scale up because they're not just dealing with having to defeat a candidate in these elections. They're not just dealing with a defamation campaign to try to get him not elected, but now they're actually dealing with someone who has control over the executive, who actually has decision-making capabilities and whose decisions might directly affect their interests. And so that's really why they're targeting the Petro government. He has consistently pledged to bring forward a total peace plan in the country. He has resumed dialogues that had been completely abandoned under the government of Ivan Duque, notably the dialogues with the National Liberation Army. These were crucial. These are central to actually achieving total peace in the country, as well as engaging in dialogue with several other armed groups, the drug trafficking groups, the FARC dissident groups, because it's a real and true commitment to peace. Whereas the right wing for decades has benefited from the situation of instability, has benefited from the irregular control over the territories and the possibility of extracting cocaine and other illicit crops from the country. And Petro really threatens all of that, not to mention, of course, the interests of private industry, the interests of the private healthcare insurance companies, of the private pension companies. So all of these sectors who lived very comfortable off the backs and off the suffering of the Colombian people are now seeing that Petro has not only been elected, he's not only now about to complete 1 year in August of his mandate, but he's serious about what he proposed. It's not just a campaign promise. It's not something that he says one day and doesn't do. It's something that he's really going to take forward. He is taking forward, and that necessarily will affect their profit, their interests, and the way they really live their lives for the past several decades.
Also, can you tell us why are the reforms important for the people of Colombia?
These reforms are fundamental for the people of Colombia, and they're part of a broader program of social change in the country. Colombia is one of the most unequal countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. It has one of the highest Gini coefficients in the region. Essential services, essential human rights, such as access to healthcare, access to education, access to dignified work, are things that millions of people live without. The EPS, private intermediary insurance companies in Colombia act as a huge obstacle to people actually accessing quality care. The healthcare system in Colombia is definitely one of the worst in the regions. Of course, beyond the anecdotal elements of people dying at the gates of the hospitals, there is a systematic lack of coverage. Oftentimes, in order for people to get slightly more complicated procedures done, they have to have several different legal processes take place. They have to make a specific demand to the insurance company. It involves many, many different trips to and from the hospital, to and from the clinic before they can even be seen. It's worth mentioning that this, of course, has devastating impacts on people's health. The fact that you have to go so many different times, get the approval, and sometimes you don't even get the approval. So this is just one small example of the fundamental aspect, not to mention, of course, that with the current healthcare system, many areas of the country, the large rural areas in Colombia, are completely uncovered. There are no health centers. In some places like Chocó, where there are no major highways, people have to travel hours and hours on the river, expensive boat rides to even get seen, get medical care. And so this is really underscores the importance of expanding the healthcare system, eliminating these private intermediaries, and making it more accessible to the people. This is just one example of why this reform is so important, not to mention the labor reform. Colombia being one of the most unequal countries in the world, and definitely in the region, many people work in the informal sector. Even people who have jobs at universities don't have full-time contracts. And so this labor reform that senators and Congress people are trying to pass specifically addresses that, trying to create more stable jobs, trying to grant labor rights to more people, because currently the majority of the workforce is in the informal sector. And even those people who are in more formal institutions still don't have these formal contracts. And so it's really a question of making that gap between the rich and the poor, making that gap between those who have stable jobs and precarious jobs smaller, granting more rights to people, and really following through on this promise for change. People were out in the streets in 2021 in the massive national strike that lasted for over 10 weeks, demanding precisely these things, because they're the levels of economic and social suffering that they're dealing with, not having access to these rights, was so extreme that it brought them to be on the streets for so many weeks in a row. And they demanded healthcare, education, dignified jobs. This is what people need to live dignified lives. This is what they've been demanding for decades. And this is what the Petro government and Historic Pact Coalition is really trying to bring to fruition.
Thanks for joining us, Zoe, for that update. This week, Atlanta City Administration approved a controversial $90 million project involving a new law enforcement facility dubbed as Cop City, despite months of opposition. On June 6, the Atlanta City Council voted in favor of this Cop City, which critics say will promote police militarization and endanger the local forests. The vote follows years of opposition from several leftist groups, environmental and social justice bodies, which has at times witnessed brutal repression at the hands of the city's police. Natalia Marquez has more details on this story. Thanks for joining us, Natalia. So can you tell us something about this vote and what were the arguments put forth and against this particular project?
So on June 6th, after several hours of public commentary through the morning, Atlanta's City Council approved $31 million in funding to help build what's been called Cop City, which is a $90 million urban warfare training facility that activists say will make it easier for police to train to oppress and repress people's movements and poor and working class communities across the country. So the vote was overwhelming. It was 11-4. So 11 city councilors voted for the funding and 4 city councilors voted against after 15 hours of public commentary, which were overwhelmingly against Cop City. And activists are saying that, while they approved $31 million, and the Atlanta Police Foundation, which is spearheading the project, says that they will raise the remaining $60 million in funds. A recent report reveals that after many decades, the project would end up costing taxpayers $67 million. This follows many years of a movement against the project, the urban warfare project.
And finally, what was the atmosphere like at the vote? Can you tell us something about that?
There were 15 hours of public comments that were overwhelmingly against the project, and by that I mean that there were 242 comments given during the public comment session, and 234 of those comments were against the building of Cop City, and only 4 comments were in favor. So that was the public's point of view. Obviously, this does not seem to be the city council's point of view, but many residents in Atlanta are outraged because it very clearly seems like the city councilors took all of the public comment for granted. They didn't listen to their constituents. They didn't listen to the residents of Atlanta. They just barreled through with whatever they were going to vote on beforehand. And people are saying that it's undemocratic, that Atlanta is not a democracy for this reason. This also follows years of repression against those who oppose Cop City. So most notably, a young activist named Tortuguita was murdered by Georgia police on January 18th. A death that has been very widely publicized. Georgia police claim that this young activist shot at police first, but the evidence reveals that simply cannot have happened. There was no gunshot residue on their hands for one thing, and many other pieces of evidence that indicate the contrary. Also, this vote follows very high-profile raids and arrests against 3 activists at a bail fund who have been accused of charity fraud, and those accusations really stem from Georgia's labeling of the anti-Cop City movement as domestic terrorists. And so, an accusation of money laundering doesn't usually result in raids by armored cars, but in this case, these activists were they were arrested in a really shocking action by the Georgia police, one that many say is designed to scare people and to repress the movement. And they recently, bail was recently posted for these activists. And even the judge who's reviewing the case against them said it was not very impressive. So obviously the movement is going to continue. People are going to continue to oppose Cop City. This is a major blow, but for many, it just reveals the undemocratic nature of the system.
Speaker of the French Parliament has said she will block a vote against the controversial pension reform enacted by the Emmanuel Macron government. The vote was seen as one of the last possibilities against the widely hated law. Just a few days ago, workers in France had hit the streets protesting the controversial pension reforms, which increased the retirement age from 62 to 64. We speak to Prashant now on the latest round of anti-pension reform protests. Prashant, what's the latest on pension reforms in France?
Right, so I think there's a lot happening. There was a vote supposed to take place on the 8th of June, that's again today when the day we are recording, but the latest news was that a speaker of the French National Assembly has said that she would not accept, she would not consider that vote. Now this vote was considered, like you said, the last ditch attempt to stop this pension reforms. Now let's maybe rewind a bit and see what has happened. First of all, the proposal was brought out in January. the idea whereby the retirement age would be increased to 64 from 62, and workers would have to work for 43 years instead to get a full-fledged pension instead of 42. And those were two of the provisions. There are many more provisions, but these were specifically very controversial. Now, since then, there were massive protests across the country. The one that took place a few days ago, I believe, was the 14th major demonstration. The demonstrations have increased and decreased in numbers, but what has not changed is the fact that there is widespread opposition, very sustained opposition to this pension reform bill. Now, it needs to be remembered that this pension reform bill has not been passed by the National Assembly, which is the lower house of parliament. It was brought before the National Assembly. The government was worried that it would not be able to pass the bill, so it used an emergency provision to pass it. So it was not voted upon. And then as part of that emergency provision, the government had to take a no confidence motion, which it won, because then the vote was not on the bill itself, but on the government's survival. So people supported it. And it was passed then by the Senate. After that, there were two attempts to enact referendums on this pension reforms. Both were rejected by the Constitutional Council. Now, this instance again would have been a vote to actually vote on the bill itself. But unless situations change during the course of the day, as we record, we don't have news of it yet. But what has happened is the Speaker of the Parliament, of course, has rejected it. And I think this itself kind of shows how precarious the position of the government is when it comes to this bill, because it may be rammed through Parliament, but it is deeply unpopular on the streets. It is deeply unpopular in Parliament as well. So you have maybe one of the most significant reforms in France in recent times not being passed by Parliament. So that really, when all these countries talk about democracy and rules-based international order and all that, what you're actually seeing in practice is such an important law not even being passed by the National Assembly of France. So, home of liberty, equality, and fraternity, and all that. So that is basically the situation right now. And like I said, the workers have said that they will continue protest. They're going to explore every kind of avenue that is there to push back against this. And I think Emmanuel Macron knows that his proposal is extremely unpopular. He's been justifying it and defending it. All his government functionaries have been defending it, saying that, it's necessary for finances, it's necessary for the future. But the sheer amount of opposition across various sectors makes it very clear that he's standing on very shaky ground. So he might have he might have subverted the democratic process and got this bill through. But I think as far as the country is concerned, the verdict is very, very clear. So in the following days, we need to wait and see if there will be more legal procedures, if there will be more parliamentary procedures to challenge, this law that has been passed.
We have been covering this particular issue on this show for a very long time, but there has been no significant change in the stance of the French government. What does the French government stand to gain by pushing through with these pension reforms?
Right. So the primary argument of the French government is that they can't really afford, pensions, because the working age population is growing older as time passes. So what they're saying is that, pensions are becoming increasingly unsustainable. So they want people to work longer so that they're able to contribute to the pension funds and stuff like that. Now, what the workers are claiming, what progressive sections are claiming, what even many centrists are claiming is that this is just one way of, raising funds, so to speak, for the economy. There are so many other ways of doing it. And the most important way, for instance, is taxing the wealthy a bit more. But that, of course, is anathema that cannot be considered in the capitalist system. So that is an option that, the government has just completely refused to consider over the years, and instead sticks to this policy of saying that it wants to increase the working age. Now, this might not see, often people cite a variety of reasons, saying that in other countries, it's much greater, or for that matter, the fact that from 62 to 64, it's not so much, it will not take effect immediately, etc., etc. But the important thing to remember is that, especially for blue-collar workers, even 2 years additionally on the job, 2 years, and that too in a country, that too in a society where the welfare state is becoming over time weaker, where there is far more underfunding of government services in various sectors, makes it far more difficult for people to, it's easy to say that it's just 2 years and when it looks at numbers, but the impact on the factory floor, as many unions have pointed out, is decisive. In fact, the impact it would have on health is extremely decisive as well, the health of workers. The impact, and again, we need to remember that it's probably going to be the poorer workers who are going to be affected the most by many of these, by this extension of working hours as well. And I think it's a larger question that at this stage in society, when there is so much wealth being created, I mean, nobody is saying that the globe as a whole, or society as a whole, or any individual country is poor. In many cases, there is a lot of wealth being created, but the distribution is really the issue. But it is the dogma of the modern capitalist system, of modern society, that we will not touch distribution. That we will not, we will leave distribution, we will leave the sharing of wealth to the supposedly market forces, and we will that is some kind of religion as far as all these all these systems are concerned. So the answer to this question is there should be more equitable distribution of wealth, and this is true not only in France but everywhere. So when people say that, okay, in some other countries people work longer, the question should be why. Why is it that people have to work longer when there can be a better distribution of wealth? So that question remains fundamentally unanswered, and that is the question that trade unions are asking. That is the question that progressive movements, the left is asking everywhere in the world. So it's no surprise that in France too they're asking exactly the same questions, and which is why the government has been just so closed off, because there is no genuine answer to that question. So they keep giving this sort of almost a slogan, very mechanical way, that we need to increase. Just 64 is what will solve the financial problem and nothing else. Working 43 years instead of 42 is what will solve this problem. There's no other way of looking at it. So that's how I would see the government's approach.
Thank you for joining us today, Prashant. And that's all we have for today. For more such stories, keep watching peoplesdispatch.org. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter.